Welcome to part 7 of our series on learning how to code using Delphi. And in this video, we're going to be taking our code to the next level where we talk about how most computer systems work, and they work using a thing called, or a sequence called input, process, output. So let's elaborate more on what that means. So let's talk about sequential programming. When we talk about sequential programming, we talk about code that runs in a particular order from the top to the bottom. Now that's very important that we get the order correct. So there is an order to how most programs work, or most computer systems, or most general systems work. And that is using what's called the input, and then going to process, and then going to output. So every system has that type of idea behind it. You first have to get information, you have to work out what the answers are, and then you give the answers back. And that works with everything. Even with a human, you do that. So for example, let's say you hear information from someone. If someone asks you a question, that is them giving you input. You are taking that information from the person asking you a question, because you are technically a computer system. And in your brain, you are going to calculate what the answer is to that, whether it's an opinion or a calculation or something like that. But unfortunately, people can't see into your brain. They can't read your mind. You have to give them the answer some way, in some sort of output. And by doing that, you use maybe your lips or you write it down. You will say that particular answer. So there is a part where you get the information, you calculate it, and you give the answer back. Now that has to follow in that sequence. If you do one of those steps out of sequence, then you're not going to get the right results. For example, you can't give me the answer before you've calculated the answer, or you can't give me the output and you haven't got the values yet. So for example, it's asking for an answer, but I haven't asked the question yet. It must be first ask the question, work out the answer, give the answer back. So that's how a human would, for example, work. But this applies to most computer systems. So if we take, for example, let's take a computer. You give information to the computer via the keyboard or the mouse. The computer will then use the processor to calculate the answers or do what the instruction is that you've given it. But we can't see what the processor is doing. We can't see the results of it unless the results are displayed somewhere, or we get particular sounds that give us information. And that is the output of the computer system. Let's do another example. Let's think about, do you like playing games? Well, if you play on an Xbox or a PlayStation, you give it commands via your controller. And then that controller those commands given by the controller will then be processed by the console. So your Xbox or PlayStation will take that information and work out what it is you want to do in the game, and then it will display the results on the screen. So if I move to the left, it'll calculate what that means, and on the screen you will see your character moving left. And what about, we all like games, we also like money. So what about an ATM? If I go to an ATM, I've got to give it a card, I've got to give it instructions via the keypad, and then the servers at the bank will work out how much money I've got available and stuff like that, and how much money it can give me, and it will give me output in the form of giving me back the money that I want, that I requested, as well as maybe a printout slip of how much money I've got left and so on. So all of these things are examples of input, process, output. So you can see them in everyday life in all computer systems. So we need to know how we can apply this to our programs. So there are a couple of steps I'm going to use. These aren't the exact steps to doing these commands, but in the beginning, if we follow these little steps to do input, to do process, to do output, it'll make our lives a lot easier when we get to more complicated programs. So let's follow these steps. Let's talk about the input first. Okay. So when we want to input values, that means we are thinking from the perspective of the computer. We are writing code for the computer to do. So we need to pretend that we are the computer. Input means I need to get information from the person using the computer program. In other words, I need to get values from components, because the user is going to interact with those components. They're going to put values into edit boxes. They're going to change the values in the split edits. So I want to get those values, because that's how I can interact with the user. And what do I want to do with them? Well, do you remember our last video on variables? Those are things that we use to store values. So I'm going to take those values from the components and put them into variables. In other words, get stuff from the user and store them in variables. That's basically what the input is. Now, there could be lots of input. There could be lots of information that we need. So we need to make sure that we declare enough variables for each input. Now, once I've done that, then I'm going to go to the processing part. Now the process part means we're going to calculate the answers, and most of the time we're going to calculate it using the variables or the values that we got from the user. Those values are in variables, so we'll use those variables, and once we've got an answer, we'll put those answers into separate variables, because I don't want to get rid of my information that I got from the user. Let's create a different variable and we will store our answers into there. So again, we are using variables to store the answers of our calculations. Okay, so remember, if we're going to declare variables, we must declare some extra variables for the calculations. So we don't just need variables for input, but variables for the process. Now, that process is great and all, but the person using the computer can't see variables. They can't see into the computer, the CPU, and see what are the values in the process, in the processor. They can't see it. So we need to take those variables that contain the answers and put them into things that the user can see. In other words, components that are visually visible on the screen, like a label or an edit box. So we're going to change the properties of those components that are displayed to the user so that they can see the results of those answers. And that would be our output step. So there we go. So those are the three things that we are going to do when we write any program. Input, get values from the user via the components and put them into variables. Process, calculate answers, put them into separate variables. Output, take those variables that contain the answers and put them into components that are visible to the user. So let's go try this in an example. Let's have a look at this example. So I've got a form where I have two edit controls, where the user can type in their name and they can type in the year that they were born. Let's pretend Mr. Long was born in the year 2000. I wish, but let's pretend. I've got two labels that obviously give me information about what must go into those edit boxes. It's just so that the user can see some information. It's good to have good information for the user. So there's two labels. Those are LBL name and LBL birth year. But these are the two components I'm worried about. It's EDT name and EDT birth year. Does everyone see that? Okay, great. And then there's a button called BTN Calculate, where we're going to calculate the age. And then I've got this little label at the bottom here called LBL Display. So what do I want the program to do? I want the program to say Mr. Long is however many years old based on the birth year that they give. So I'm doing this video in the year 2022. So therefore, the way to work out the age is you take 2022 for this year and you minus whatever they type in there. Remember, this program must work for whatever information they give us. It mustn't just work for 2000. It must work for any number that they give us and for any name. So I click on the button. I want to see the word in this answer, in this display, LBL display. I want to say Mr. Long is 22 years old. That's what I want to see. Okay, so so that must happen when I click on the button. So I'm going to click on the button so we can write code. So remember, the program has three steps. It has an input step, so I'm writing comments here. It has a process step, and it has an output step. Okay, so let's go through the steps. The first step is input. We need to get the values that the user is going to put into these components and store them into variables. So I need variables for the input. So let's go back. I need a Mr. That's a name. What type of variable? If you remember, what type of variable is Mr. Long? Well, that's text. So that is a string variable. And 2000, that is an integer. It's not a decimal number, so no one's born in the year 2000.5. It's an integer value, a whole number. So that's an integer, and that is a text value that we want to get. That's the input that we want. So I'm going to come here. Remember, between procedure and begin, we're going to put a space and we're going to say var, declare a variable. And I'm going to declare a variable called name. No, but let's put an S in front of it because it's going to be a string variable. So S name is of type string. So S name colon string semicolon. That means I've declared a variable of type S name, which is, it's called S name of type string. And now I need an integer variable. So on a new line, I don't need to type the var again. I'm going to type in year. Year. So we input a semicolon. What type of variable is year? Remember, I put an I. Why did I put an I? Because I know that's going to be an integer. Remember, in our video on variables, it's ideal for us to have a nice name that is unique, but we can put the type of variable in front of it. It makes our life easier when we're writing code. You don't have to, but it's a good technique to use. So that's an integer. That is a name. So we want to change those. We don't want to change the components. Remember, the user is changing the components. We are the computer system. We are representing the computer system, which means we want to change those variables to whatever the user has typed into those components. And the first one's EDT name. So I want to change S name. So S name comes on the left. Then I go assigned to colon equal to is assigned a value from which component? EDT name. So EDT name is the component that we're going to fetch the name from. However, EDT name is a big component. It's got all of these properties. If I click on it, look, it's got all of these properties. Which property do we want from the edit box that contains what's inside it? Do you remember? It's the text property. Whatever the text property is what's inside the edit box. So the edit box dot text. Okay, so if I type that dot text, just for interest sake, type text. You see it's a T caption, and T caption is another example of a string. So let's just recap. The text property is a string. S name is a string. We are trying to put a string into a string. Does it fit? Remember our analysis? Do the shapes fit? Well, a string into a string, it's the same. They fit. We are happy with that. So that's correct. We're happy with that. So it's going to take that value from the text box and put it into S name. Now we are going to do the same for I here. We're going to take I here. We're going to assign it the value from EDT birth here. So EDT birth here. Now what property of that edit box contains what's typed in it? Yes, same as last time. It's a text property. There we go. So text property, there we go. So it's going to take the text value, that 2000, and put it into I here. However, what, Mr. Long, this is a string. We said this was a string. And this is a integer. They don't fit. You can't put a string into an integer. They're not the same thing. But we really need to get it from the text. So what do we do? Well, I know this is going to be some sort of number that is in text format, but if there was a way we could convert it from what it is, what is it? It is a string to what I want it to become. I want it to become an integer. So there is a function. Now in Delphi, functions means you're going to have the name of the function. So I'll type here function name. And then in brackets, you will have what information it needs for that function. And then it's going to send back a result somewhere over here. So you can always have some sort of variable is equal to the function name. And then inside the function, you need the parameters or the information that it needs. Okay, so that's ideally what, if we think about a function. Take function, does what it needs to do with that information, and sends it back. Now, there is a function called a str, which is short for string, strtOint. I write it in capital letters and small letters like that, so you can see it doesn't matter if you do all small or all big, but a string to int function. It takes in brackets, if we give it a string, you see it needs a string in the brackets. If I give it one string in the brackets, it will take that string and convert it from a string to an int, if it is a valid integer, and put it into I here. So this is a conversion. It converts the string to an integer, converts the string text to, that takes that 2000 text basically, like that, and makes it into the number 2000, which we can use for calculations. So there we go. Now it does fit. Now that it's converted, it does fit. So there we go. So now they both fit. Everything works. We're happy. Great. We've taken the values from the components and put them into variables. Now we can move on to the process. What do we want to do in process? Process, we want to take those values and work out information. Now we want to work out the age. I don't actually need anything from the name, but I do need to work out the age. And we want to take the age, which is 2022 minus the year that they were born. So I need to create another variable to store the age. What type of variable would age be? That would also be an integer. Yeah. So we want to create another integer. So in the integer little area, we're going to put a comma because I want another one. Age. Are we happy with that? So it's the age variable. We put an I, so it's integer. Fantastic. We know that we got age. We want to put the answer into our age. So over here, I'm going to write our age. And then we're going to say assigned a value of 2020. I know this program only works for 2020. Later on, we'll learn about date functions and stuff like that. But for now, we're just going to take today's year. You could change it, obviously, to whatever year you are doing this program in. 2022 minus 2000. And that will give me the answer. But this will only give me the answer if every person who uses the program is born in the year 2000. What happens if they're not? Well, we don't actually want to use, we always want to use 2022 in this case, but the 2000 is actually going to be different depending on what the user types there. So we actually want to get that value, which we know is stored in there. I here has the value of when they were born. So I'm going to not use 2000, but I here. Go fetch the value from the I here variable, take 2022 and minus that value, and then store that answer in IH. This is an integer. This is an integer. If we subtract integers, the answer is going to be also an integer. Everything fits. Is there anything else that I need to calculate? No, that's all I need to calculate. Fantastic. We can now move on to the output step. The output step is we want to display something that looks like this. Mr. Long is 22 years old. So I want it to look like that. So how do I do that? First of all, I'm going to put the answer into LBL display. So I'm changing LBL display. So my output is LBL display is now going to change because it's on the left. But what property of LBL display? How do I change what the user can see of that label? Well, that is the caption, Mr. Long. If I click on it there, the caption, that's what the user can see. So we're going to just change the caption of it, which is a string type thing. It's a string variable that. So the display's caption is a string. We want to put a string into there that says Mr. Long is 22 years old. Now, where do I get Mr. Long from? Well, I get it from the variable that's stored in the name, S name. So I'm going to say, hey, take the S name variable. Whatever's inside that variable, take that. Then I want to add an is before I get to the number 22. So I'm going to say, now to add strings together, you can just plus them. So we're going to plus the word is. Okay. Now, the little thing to take note here, if I plus is like that, it's going to put that is right next to the name. So it's going to go Mr. Long is like that. So we actually want a space is space. So we're actually going to put a little space there. Boom, another space on that side, so we can put a space on either side of the word is. And you'll notice when I'm referring to variables, string variables, I can just call them by their name. But when I'm talking about text as it is, I must put it in the single quotes so that it turns into blue. Then I'm going to add, where do I get the 22 from? Well, I get it from this variable, the IH variable. So IH, there we go. And then I'm going to add, at the end of the IH, a space followed by years old full stop. So I'm actually going to copy that. And we're going to have it as is. So we're going to say in single quotes. So plus years old full stop. Remember the little space after the age. And then we put a semicolon at the end of the line. So there we go. So we're going to take the name with an is, with the age and the years old, and put that into the caption, which is a string. And if you add strings, everything is okay. That's a string. That's a string. That's a string. Oh no, that's not a string. Mr. Long, that's not a string. It's not going to work. That's why there's an error here. It says, hey, there's a problem with this. You can't put an integer into a string. Well, we want it to be a string. Is there a way that we can convert it from what it is, it's an integer, to what I want it to become, a string? What it is, an integer, I want it to be a string. So I want to, is there a function like this that takes an integer and sends back a string? Yes, there is. So it doesn't have to go into a variable. It can go into a place which is being stored information. So I'm going to say, yes, take this integer, convert it from an integer. It is TOSTR. Take the integer that's inside the brackets, convert it from an int, it is an int, to a string, and that will then result in this whole thing being a string. So therefore, I've got a string plus a string. This is now converted to string. That's a string. Now it should all work. So originally this didn't fit into there. Now it does because it's the same type. So this is now a string. As long as that's a number, it'll convert it from int to a string. Fantastic. It's almost like, if you notice here, it's almost like the reverse. Input and output is almost like the reverse. In the input, we are taking the variables and assigning them values from the components. And in output, we are taking components and giving them values from the variables. And when we have conversions, it's almost like, yeah, if we've got an integer, we go from string to int. But on this side, we're going int to string. So it's almost like a mirror image of each other. So let's test it out. Let's go run it and see what it looks like. So obviously, we said this only works for the year 2022. If you're working in a different year, change that 2022 to whatever year you're using. If you wanted to be fancy, you could have a little place where they enter in the current year, but later on we'll learn about date functions where you can actually get the current date. So there we go. We've got Mr. Long, 2000. I click on calculate age. Boom. Mr. Long it converts to 22 years old. Now, if I change this to, let's change this to Bruce. And Bruce was born in 1995. And if I click on it, it takes the Bruce variable, whatever was in there, that's in the S name, calculates the age, which is 27 years old. So now it works for whatever case we give it. There we go. There is an example of input, process, output. And all of your programs are probably going to have that type of sequence. So get used to doing input, process, output. Input, taking values from the edit controls, or whatever input values, and putting them into variables. The process is calculating the answers and storing them into variables, and the output is taking those variables that have the answers and displaying them in components. Just a quick side note, if you remember in our previous video, we learned about a spin edit. If you remember the spin edit, that's what it looks like, where you can take, I don't want to add one, but you can go up and down with your answers. That's ideally suited for integers. So I've created a spin edit. I've called it SED birth here because it's not an edit box. It's a spin edit. And I changed its value, because that's why we put the value inside, to 2000. Now, if I change this program, if I don't want this, if I want the spin edit, if I actually put it like over almost, then when I calculate the age, I'm not getting the value from the edit control. I'm getting it from SED birth here. What property of SED birth here? From the value property. Now there you can see the value property is what type? It's an integer. In this case, this is quite nice because this is an integer, this is an integer. There's no need to convert it on this side because they both match and therefore they fit. But obviously we still need to do the conversion here because we're trying to put the age variable into a string. But there's an example of a better use of integers is probably to use a spin edit. But you don't have to. You could use the edit controls like we did earlier, as long as you remember to convert them. Support the channel by clicking on that subscribe button, even if it means turning the notifications off because you get annoyed by all our videos, that's fine. Click on that subscribe button, leave a like, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And remember, don't do it the long way. Do it the Mr. Long way.